Emeritus. Okay. I'm Huma Ahmed Ghosh, Faculty Emeritus, Department of Women's Studies, and past Director of the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies. On behalf of the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our guest speaker, Dr. Amina Wadud, who has graciously agreed to speak today as part of our 20th anniversary celebration. We have a speaker series and we're really honored to have you here, Dr. Wadud. I also want to let all the audience and everybody know that on the 7th of April at 6 p.m., this 20th anniversary will culminate in a celebration. So please look out for more emails. I know I'm a very persistent email sender, but why not? Also, a very, very warm welcome to all our guests who have taken time out to attend this event. This is a webinar, so you will not have access to the participants nor the speaker during the conversation, but you can send your questions to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I also would like you to note that this event will be recorded. So if you or your friends want to access it later, it will be available as a YouTube event on the Center for Islamic Studies webpage. Dr. Amina Wadud doesn't need much of an introduction, but for those of you who are young and new to the field, she is a world-renowned scholar and activist with a focus on Islam, justice, gender, and sexuality. After achieving full professor, she retired from US academia, except as a visiting researcher to Starr King School for the ministry in California. After 15 years in retirement, Dr. Wadud has recently returned to academia as a visiting professor to the National Islamic University in Jogjakarta, Indonesia. I must say she's very brave, but I'm so grateful for that. She migrated to Indonesia in 2018 to avoid the chaos of US politics and ethics firsthand. Dr. Wadud is the author of Qur'an and Woman, Rereading the Sacred Text from a Women's Perspective, a classic that has helped towards the development of epistemology and methodology in Islamic feminism, which is the most dynamic aspect of Islamic reform today. It is a 3 decades, 30 years old text, which is still most commonly used in Islamic feminist courses and has been translated in over 10 languages, most recently into French. Dr. Wadud's second book, Inside the GenderJihad, Women's Reform in Islam, moved the discussion further by aligning it with a mandate for ethics and activism in collaboration with scholarship and spirituality. After completing a 3-year research grant investigating 500 years of Islamic classical discourse on sexuality, on sexual diversity and human dignity, funded by the Arcus Foundation, she is organizing an international center for queer Islamic studies and theology, the first of its kind in the world. Also, it's a compliment and something that for most women very inspiring. She's a mother of 5 and nana to 6. She's also best known as the Lady Imam, about which I will ask her a question once we start the conversation. Welcome, Dr. Wadud. We are really honored to have you here. To start off the discussion and conversation, I would like you to talk a little bit about your background, how and why you converted to Islam, and your interest specifically in gender-based research and Islam.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. Thank you so much, Professor, for having me. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. This is the week of International Women's Day, and this is Women's History Month, so it's a very auspicious occasion for you to also enjoy your 20th anniversary. there at San Diego State University in the Islamic Studies program. So I'm really honored. I had the fortune of being born into a family where my father was a Methodist minister. He dedicated his life to a calling he felt in his late teens. And the fortune of it was that, number one, I was raised with a man whose integrity with regard to his faith was consistent in his practice at home. And secondly, I was raised on the God of love. So I took the name Wadud. Eventually, I recognized that there is not just one religion or one way even to do that religion. And I literally began a pursuit into the world's religions, practicing Buddhism for a year before being embraced by Islam. The interesting thing about my experience of conversion is that within a very short period of time, I fell in love with the Qur'an. And I then dedicated the rest of my life to removing the impediments between me and the text, not only in terms of the need for the mastery of the Arabic language, but also for critical reading with regard to textual analysis and hermeneutics. In this way, actually, I'm really fortunate. I will soon be celebrating 50 years as a Muslim, as an adult. And in that time, I am still in love with the Quran, and I am still motivated by the very notion that the divine will intervene in the life of created beings, especially human creatures, and that the result of that would itself forge a history, an ethic, and an intellectual trajectory that we are still actively examining and re-examining for the purpose of affirming what is the best of what we understand from it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that is excellent background for those who are interested in, seeing the connections that you made in your choices and how, it is all about the value system and faith. So since your work, I don't know if you would define it as Islamic feminism, but I would like you to speak to the historical and ideological significance of the development of Islamic feminism, especially with an emphasis on how your own work being different than other Islamic feminists.
I think I should probably confess that I've only accepted to identify myself as feminist for the last 12 years. Before that time, I was stuck, like many people were, between a very secular and anti-religion articulation of feminism and a very patriarchal articulation of Islam. And the strife between these two articulations, which could be held even by Muslims themselves, particularly Muslim women, just led me to say that somewhere there's no reconciliation. And yet, it was the reconciliation that became significant to my being able to affirm my own identity as an Islamic feminist and to look at the ideology and history in such a way as to become a part of the solution. In 1995, when I was at the Beijing Conference for Women, Muslim women decided they would form a caucus, and they could not reconcile these two dominant voices. On the one hand, the secularists said, human rights and feminists need to be without religion in the discourse at all. And the Islamist or political Islamic voice said there doesn't need to be any human rights because Islam is perfect and it gave women their rights, over 1400 years ago. And they both agreed you cannot have both Islam and feminism. What happened since 1995 was an understanding that the definitions that each of them had given to their categories were in fact exclusive. In other words, feminism was not broad enough to embrace Islam, and Islam was not universal enough to embrace feminism. And that's when we began to take authority for the definition, not only of feminism, but the definition of Islam. And when you wrestle them away from their stagnation, you come up with Islamic feminism. Not all Muslim feminists are Islamic feminists, because for me, the methodology of Islamic feminism is a part of the ongoing intellectual engagement with finding the truth and living that truth, which is the legacy of the Islamic intellectual history. So you could be a Muslim feminist and you use purely secular or purely liberal Western paradigms, but to be an Islamic feminist, you really have to have a notion that the best way to go forward with the affirmation of the full equality and dignity of women is through a critical reading of Islam, Islamic sources, and of the Islamic trajectory.
Thank you. Yes, I totally agree with you. And I think your response is a perfect segue into the next question, which is, and it's also related to your current work that we are looking forward to, is what are your views on gender identity and sexuality? And, because I know that your writings and your future projects are going to look into that in more detail. So could you enlighten us with your views and Islam and the way you look at the whole issue of Islamic feminism and sexuality? That would be great.
What's interesting is the foundational target of Islamic knowledge of Islam, of the Qur'an, of the Sunnah of the Prophet, upon him be peace. The foundational target of all of these is how to live your best life as a human being. Obviously, those sources also project the notion that your best life would be one which is in surrender to the divine order of the entire universe. If you align yourself with the beauty and the harmony of the universe, then you yourself will find beauty and harmony. It is true, however, that the legacy of Islamic thought is very heavily patriarchal. From about the Abbasid period, we have a very fragmented and sometimes totally silent participation of women about their ways of knowing and their ways of being. And we quickly came to the understanding that we needed to move forward from this, to reform, to rethink, and to produce new knowledge. However, we still had not really understood how to use gender as a category of thought. In other words, to have gender, which is a construct, something that is completely made by humans, that is lived by humans, whether they acknowledge the construct or not, to have gender be one of the tools that's used to examine the intellectual legacy. And furthermore, to have gender identities as a part of the conversation with regard to what it means to be human, and as a human to surrender in Islam or be Muslim. That's the most exciting thing I think about our time. And that is from the purely sort of heterodominant notion of gender discourse, we have now moved into, I think, a fabric that is much more nuanced and fine-tuned in order to acknowledge that gender identities are not fixed. Everything that is male is not masculine, and everything that is feminine is not female. In fact, for me, I relate these to the attributes of Allah that are divided between the Jamal, the feminine, and the Jalal, the masculine. So I don't believe Allah is male, I don't believe Allah is female, but that Allah has the tawheed, or the unification of the reality and the necessity of them both. In our own self, in our own souls, in our own being, in our own societies, then we must project that kind of unity. And I think the simple language of it is the respect for diversity. that diversity is one of the most amazing aspects of being on the planet. No two things are exactly alike, even when there are so many similarities. And an affirmation of the differences between things simply has to go on as a part of that necessity of human well-being and integrity, but not as a form of competition or rivalry, but rather that we live in mutual harmony, interdependence, necessary support, and obviously equality. So we mirror the journey for each of us within ourselves and in the ways in which we relate. To see this come about in the context of Islam and Islamic studies has been, I think, again, one of the most exciting parts about being a Muslim woman at this time.
I am tempted to ask you, uh, where has the resistance been? Are you experiencing any resistance?
If the world is diverse, then there's surely going to be people who don't agree with me. Mercifully, as you mentioned earlier, I had 5 children and they don't agree with me on everything, and yet I love them. So I have learned to accept that there will be some disagreement. I think the difference is that we have a tradition as Muslims that affirms what the Sufis call adab, the necessity of a certain rapport and a certain respect, even when we engage in conversations or actions that reflect our own diverse locations. Sometimes that's been missing, and sometimes I've had to deal with, I think my favorite is what I call tough fiery trolls. Because of course, you know, the World Wide Web is the new dominant model of communication. And as such, it's free and open to so many people. And therefore, those people who disagree with you will take advantage of that to just say negative things. But I basically believe that because all of life is changing constantly, the skin cells on your body are completely different after 6 weeks. Because everything is changing, because Allah is hayy or living, that change is inevitable. So the affirmation of the need for us to challenge the previous Hellenistic and Greek philosophical model, which was incorporated into Islamic thought, of differences meaning hegemony to differences meaning reciprocity, I think we can move there. So I try not to give my focus to the naysayers. And I realized that if I spent the rest of my life every day and every hour of the day trying to do something that is good and positive, that I would not exhaust the good and the positive that's there. So in a way, I don't have time for the naysayers.
Very well said. Yes, totally with it. You're right, because this is such important work, and it is well past the time when these discussions should have been held, and also they were held, they were suppressed. So I'm so glad that you're bringing it to the forefront, and that we will see an organization, we will see publications specifically on this topic, which then brings me to my next question, which is on intersectionality and Islamic reform, because I think that's where you're really headed. And so if you could speak to that, yeah.
So obviously from the beginning of the critical engagement from Professor Crenshaw over intersectionality, it's become much more common parlance. And yet, I have never seen an intersectionality that is inclusive of all of the capacity and the limitations that occur within the human species. So we tend to go from broad categories based on her original analysis, which is, gender, race, and class. But remember what I said that happened in 1995 at Beijing, which I witnessed myself. The discourse with regard to religion and culture, unfortunately, has not been as equally intersected with the main discourse over intersectionality. So while I affirm it, I also am hopefully always clear to say something always gets left out. If we don't have a discussion, for example, about ableism, then that means that part of our conversation, even when we consider these larger social and political intersections, part of our conversation is still missing in terms of the affirmation of the diversity and distinctions between humans. And since my work in the area of Islam, and in particular, the grander category of religion, I often find that it is equally possible for people to be very radical in their, race, class, and gender intersection, and to totally leave out the consideration of religion. That's why, as I said earlier, that Islamic feminism is particularly located within the discourses of Islam that have existed, for more than 14 centuries, as opposed to just being Muslim and woman, and therefore you could use sort of Western, at least initiated in the West, paradigms of feminism. So I love this notion of intersectionality. I love being a part of the popularization of the term, but I also am a little bit critical because I have never seen all of the categories of human diversity manage to get in there at any one time, because it's a bit messy. I'm all for the mess, but because I'm still grappling with the reality, for example, of Islamophobia that has, been in the academic world as well as the political world. I'm so sensitive to that whenever people think that they are inclusive just because they simply do race, class, and gender without doing religion and culture, for example, that I always say, well, there's still more dimensions to it.
You're very right, because it is so historically and politically based, and then social class is such a big variable that gets ignored. Coming from a Marxist tradition, that's where I also feel is problematic sometimes. But like you said about Islamophobia, is how it is played out in the US, and then how it's played out in India with the Hindu majority. All of these things make such a big difference. But given that, religion, if religion is a major part of anybody's identity, then I would like to see more literature and discussion on the whole concept of intersectionality. Because you're right, it is confined so much to gender, race, and class within a historical context that it does take away from the larger discussion. But of course, we are all very grateful to Kimberly Crenshaw and many other writers who are not using the word, but using the concept or the feminist literature that we do have. And so now I really want to jump into something which is about the lady imam and your activism and the women's mosque movements, because we are seeing that globally. And I mean, you were one of the first ones. So if you could talk to your experiences and how it has come along, if it has, and what are the various ways in which women are engaging in this discourse.
Like you, I'm happy to see that there is a proliferation. There is a publication coming out in 2021 on women's khutbahs, or Friday sermons, which I have an essay included in, but to which I'm looking forward, because sometimes the problem between activism and academia is not easily resolved. And for me, I came out of a purely theoretical and theological humanities location, finishing up my PhD, which became, my first book, Qur'an and Woman, into Malaysia, where I joined the International Islamic University. And within 1 month, mercifully, I began meeting with women who formed an organization called Sisters in Islam. They are now, therefore, more than 30 years strong themselves. And they were the sort of launchpad for a global movement called Musawa, because when you live in countries that are still using forms of Muslim personal status law, you are up against a block for how you engage the gender hegemonies of these laws, because basically they tell you, well, that's Islam. And as I said earlier, when we took agency and we understood the necessity of our own authority with regard to the definition, not only of Islam, but in terms of the way that the state will use Islam to promote and sustain certain stagnant and hegemonic notions regarding gender and sexuality. So that part of activism to me was one of the blessings of my life, because I came into it in a way that really showed me I also need to think about my academic work outside of the epistemology and also into its sort of pragmatic aspects. I'm still learning, but one of the ways in which I now start to articulate that intersection is what I called embodied ethics. And I believe that when we assert ethical formulas about what it means to be Muslim and what it means to do justice, or even just what is ethics, that we need to embody it. In other words, not to have a disparity between what we say and what we do. And that location has encouraged me to accept invitations to engage in embodied ethics in the form of Muslim ritual devotions. Muslim ritual devotions like prayer, like, even the month of Ramadan that's coming up, has been so centered on men's participation fully and women's conditional inclusion, that we think that that is actually encoded within the foundational text of the religion, when it is not. It is a conclusion asserted by male thinkers, jurists, even ethicists, that was based fundamentally on the notion that women were subjective human beings and men were the potential for the fully realized human being. So being invited to do these things caused me also to have to go back and think about what does it mean for me, as a person, as an individual, but also what does my participation in it mean to project in terms of the community. And for me, it is not just because I believe in Allah and therefore I dedicate myself to Allah, and I also practice worship in accordance to the ways in which they have been projected in Islamic thought, but also that I do them in this Black female body. And whenever there is a disparity between an articulation of what it means to be a devotee or to worship and any body, then that means that there is a flaw in the assertion. Because again, we're always told not only is Islam for all places and all times, but also it is for all people.
Yeah.
It is interesting also that, sort of watching the development of women's mosque spaces or women-led rituals within all different kinds of Muslim collectives. But actually the first part of these inclusive movements were from queer Muslims. And queer Muslims have an interesting contribution that they have made to the discourse over universalism and inclusion in Islam. And that is that they were told consistently that you can't be both Muslim and gay, for example. They were told that somehow to be one of those things meant that you could not be the other thing. And actually, the fallacy of this articulation is because Islam, if it is for all times and all places and all people, cannot be closed out to a person because of their gender identity or their sexual preferences. And so it was my pleasure to work in queer Muslim spaces for about 2 decades now, and to, in particular, see the ways in which queer Muslims struggled to maintain their heritages and their choice of Islam as religion and religious identity, and yet not find the spaces to exercise that dedication. So the inclusion movement started with queer identities and was taken up by women, whether or not they identify as queer, and again, whether or not all of the women's spaces are equally inclusive of sexual diversity. But for the most part, they have, made that articulation and they are inclusive. But what it means is that you can practice no matter what is your gender identity. And that is the original idea. That is the foundational idea. So now we have to once again make it into the goal, and that anyone can be included. And all you have to do is, bring the heart that desires to be in participation of these particular kinds of ritual observances in order to know your Lord better and to be the full person that you were created to be.
Wonderful. And thank you so much for bringing in this fact about the queer Muslims really trying to, challenge what existed and create the space, because I was not aware of that. And usually the way the literature is that it is the women and, heterosexual women who've been fighting for women's rights in the mosques, especially in India. They're upset with having to be at the back or behind the curtain. But I think this connection is very valuable, especially when we talk about gender and Islam. This intersectionality definitely is a very, very important one. And so what are your views, though, on the various kinds of engagement of gender and the mosque? Because just a few years ago in Los Angeles, a separate women's mosque was opened. Then I know of another mosque where women can be in the same space but be at the back. So there are different kinds of negotiations going on, but I'm not sure how many of those negotiations are really trying to challenge basically the participation in the ritual that men have. But I don't know if sometimes they're trying to separate the two and maintain the gender segregation. Which would be, in your mind, the better way to, strategize this discussion?
I think, again, the lessons that I learned by being engaged with the activists is that we always need multiple strategies. So it's not one above another. It is always going to be located within your own context, and whatever moves you forward in terms of full equality and reciprocity, those are the steps that you should be taking to make that movement. So for some situations, just for women to have access to the mosque space is a revolution.
Yeah.
Right now, for example, when you make a pilgrimage, you make the Hajj to Saudi Arabia, women are not allowed to walk past the gravesite of the Prophet anymore. So we're excluded from, I say, giving our salams to the Prophet and, waiting for that response. So in some places, it is simply the right to participate that we have to struggle for. And in other places, it is the right to be able to contribute as an agent, to lead the salah, to give the khutbah, to call to prayer, to build our own mosque. In Indonesia, they don't use the word masjid for a place if it's exclusive to women. They have no problem with making spaces available for women in the mosque. They have no problem with creating women-only spaces, but they used to call them the musallas. They didn't use the word masjid. And I know a woman here who built a mosque from the ground up, and she called it the women's masjid, Masjid Perempuan. So the steps that has to be taken always have to be localized, and moving forward from your own locality to your next highest inclusive, harmonious, and beautiful articulation is the only way to go. Everybody cannot do everything because everybody is not ready, because the steps that have to be taken sometimes are very clearly pronounced. So I definitely believe in all of the above. And I definitely applaud the efforts that are made globally by women and men to be inclusive at different levels from the ones that they maybe have practiced, when they were growing up, or, even 10 years ago. And hopefully when we get to the place where there is no distinction except on the basis of taqwa, according to the Quran. This is God consciousness that leads to certain ethical actions. When we arrive at that place, then it will make no difference because everyone will be affirmed in their identity as human and Muslim for the practice of these worships and the construction of spaces in which this can happen. But we are nowhere near that now. And therefore, I applaud the efforts that are made step by step in any location as being a part of the way towards the future.
Since you brought up the word Hajj, or the event of Hajj, last summer I was on a panel where the Hajj went virtual. And the questions being raised was, would that be something that continues for the future? And would that also then maybe open up participation in Hajj rituals by people just across ages and social class, etc., given how expensive it is, and across genders, would that, have you ever thought about that? I mean, I know we had.
And also across age and ableist barriers. I am happy to say that there is a concerted effort to make available access for people with different abilities at the Hajj. And they do, they have guys running around with wheelchairs. You pay them a little fee and they will do your tawaf, and they have a ramp that allows you to do that easily without, any problems for people who are rushing, when they're able-bodied. But the virtual world, the last year of being on lockdown has given us many seeds that really could be planted to lead to, glorious and healthy plants. And I hope that we take advantage of it. I myself last year participated in virtual Tarawih the entire month. I only missed one time when I had an interview for a program in the UK. And so that's 29 out of 30 because I'm that age. That's a record for me. So the virtual practice really made a difference. I also gave khutbah for both Eids last year, Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha. And with Eid al-Fitr, it was with my small group who had been doing the Tarawih prayer together, mostly led by one of our friends and colleagues who was male, but occasionally I led them. And I learned something with regard to this, and that is that if you prioritize the practice of the worship over the formula that form the body of the one who is coordinating the worship, because I don't believe that the imam is a leader. I believe the imam is a functionary role that facilitates a collective form of devotion. And it was easier to do this when we had the virtual. So what will happen when we return more to the physical? Will people try to go back to the old formulas? Obviously, some people will, but we have a momentum now that allows us to understand that making certain things accessible fulfills, I think, the ethical mandate of Islam in terms of justice, dignity, and inclusion. So I'm really looking forward to what will happen when we come out of the pandemic, for many reasons, obviously, but I'm also looking for the ways in which we re-articulate how the performance of Islamic ritual can be made in such a way that barriers between people are removed, and therefore we can spend more of our attention on the distance between us and Allah. Let that be the only barrier we have to overcome, how to experience that oneness, with our Creator, instead of how to negotiate with, community structures that are hegemonic and exclusive. And I don't know who will be looking at this specifically, but I really think it's going to be quite interesting in terms of what we learned from the lockdown with regards to our participation in things like Hajj and, in prayer.
Yeah, I'm also curious. I think this coming summer, it might still be virtual. But sometimes, the reality hits you hard and you look at the economics of it in Saudi Arabia and then you wonder, how controlled it might be. But, it's something, like you said, it's wait and see and hope that, it's something that everybody can partake in now because of the virtual possibilities.
Sure.
I want to shift gears here a little bit, and it's really interesting that after 15 years of retirement, you did decide to go back to academia. And like I said earlier, that's really brave of you. And I've just been partially retired for 3 months, and I cannot even think about it just now. So my question to you is that as you return now to academia, I am sure you have seen major changes in the discipline and, and especially what you're teaching to the graduate programs. I'm wondering if you're challenging the earlier knowledge that existed, but also challenges of US academia in the past and how returning after 15 years reflects both the changes in the system of academia and the changes in yourself relative to the academic approach to Islam and Islamic thought.
Well, being a bona fide nerd, I've always been, interested in, education and intellectual reflection, knowledge, thought, wisdom. And so in a way, I would think that academia would be a really good niche for me. But after, a certain number of years, actually turned out to be also 15 years, in US academia after I left Malaysia and returned to the US, I think I experienced despair on a number of levels. One of it had to do with the inability for the intersection to allow for critical consideration in the sense of interdisciplinary engagement. For example, the American Academy of Religion as a professional group, I, as a Black woman, would have to choose between the Black religion sections, the Islam sections, and the women in religion sections because they were always held simultaneously. And I pointed this out during the years that I was still a participant, and there was always, some kind of token response or out and out rejection, which is, I think also quite fascinating. And as we passed the fork in the road where things turned because of the attacks on September 11th, I did not have a lot of hope that Muslim women's studies would make progress in the context of the US. And I saw that as, the necessary way forward for me. So I pulled out of the US academic setting. Literally, I tendered my documents for promotion to full professor, and then I got it, and I said, thank you, I'm not coming back. But I did this in order to free myself from the institution of academia and allow myself some flexibility in terms of resources. But I always felt like there were ways in which I could have experienced that differently and better. And yet when we look back now and we look at our current situation, what we see is, for example, the endowed chair positions in various universities in America on the area of Islamic studies have gone first to white men, then to Black men, and now we're starting to get a few scattering things in terms of women. To have this affirmation as a Black woman, which I think would have been a natural place for me, did not happen and may not happen in my lifetime in the US. And I have a philosophy about trying not to meet a negative with a negative because I think it's detrimental to my soul. And I thought, well, rather than to constantly fight in that setting, maybe I should pull myself away and make my contributions in other ways. Fortunately, gender studies has developed really strongly in the area of Islam in the US and globally. Here in Indonesia, for example, I met my first male head of the Gender Studies and Islam program, which, Indonesia has some interesting things, to manifest. The affirmation of the importance of education is part of the fabric of Islam in Indonesia, starting with the pesantren, which is the boarding school system, even as early as elementary school age. So the wedding between knowledge, activism, and spirituality here is much more seamless. And that allows me not to have to fight against the negatives that I experience in order to keep those three things, in harmony in my own person. It is moving forward in the context of US academia, and I'm hopeful that it will continue to move forward, and that the critical self evaluation that is necessary for what we call the production of new knowledge in Islam will have a better opportunity. Most of Islamic studies in the US is about history, political science, a little bit about tasawwuf or Sufism. So to even arrive at the place where the new knowledge that's being produced, particularly in terms of Islamic feminism, to arrive at a place where that is a objective of US academia, it's not happening even yet, because we still reiterate the knowledge of the past as being the sole framework, as opposed to as being a stepping stone, and that we continually create new frames. And from these frames, we actually create new knowledge and therefore new perspectives on knowledge and truth and wisdom, and therefore of Islam. And I did not see that happening when I left US academia, but I had a very fruitful 15 years retired. And when I came to Indonesia, it came up early that maybe I would, return. I did teach here once while I was retired, that maybe I would return here, but I was still finishing up my research. So I thought, I don't need to think about, what happened next, because I want to be fully present for this research. And then I contacted, people who had reached out to me, administrators here, and I said, I'd like to propose to do this course on what I call a methodology of reading for gender. And so I came a year ago and a month, came in February 2020, and had very wonderful reception. And we talked about, coming as a visiting professor, and, the details were being worked out, and COVID hit. And so I did not make the move to come in 2020, but literally I arrived in January 2021 with the hope that we'll be sometime this year seeing the end of the pandemic. And it gives me an opportunity to have an official location. I'm not afraid not to have an official location. I can just locate myself as a lady imam, and that makes me happy. But to have an official location in the context of an Islamic university in the most populous Muslim country in the world is, I think, I don't know, I think it's like a shining light over whatever might have been dark moments in the trajectory to get here.
So when you talk about, production of knowledge and new epistemologies, can you go into some detail with some examples of what you mean by that, especially over the last decade or so, yeah?
Yes, and I also want to confirm that I came to understand this working with activist groups, particularly working with Musawa, who has been working on knowledge production and training others along those lines, even those who are not academics, just working in real community context or with the law or with the culture and the like. And one of the things that I think is most fascinating from my friend and colleague, Dr. Ziba Mir Husseini, was the interrogation of the foundational and universally agreed idea of justice. In the past, justice did not mean equality and reciprocity. Justice was a proportional distribution based, however, on unequal locations. That's why we could have slavery. And we understand justice today as being equality and reciprocity. So how do we examine the Islamic intellectual legacy, its ethical trajectory, its spiritual allocation and direction? If we say justice, but we mean that a man is on top of a woman or men are in charge. We have a publication called Men in Charge ? Which is brilliant, one of the most excellent books that's ever been written that I had the pleasure to participate in my life. So if this is where justice is, it means that if men have more space in the mosque, or if women are not allowed to drive, all that's fine because, it's just. But when you start working on, the Musawa model, literally the word Musawa means reciprocal equality, then you want justice to be mirrored in your locations across gender, sexuality, race, class, language, ableism, and the like. So the epistemological understanding of this requires us to interrogate the ways in which classical Islamic thought continually participated in the hegemonic model and considered that to be Islam. Professor Zahra Ayubi just wrote a book called Gendered Moralities, also brilliant, in which she showed that there was a fundamental understanding of a distinction between women and men in ethics, where men were given the highest potential, even if they hadn't reached it. They had the potential, but women were not. And so that means that the entire ethical structure is built on a concept of justice, which was in fact not only acceptable in Greek and Hellenistic philosophy, and therefore promoted and sustained in Islam and Islamic thought, but is no longer tenable. And the disjunction between the tenable and the untenable epistemologies or articulations of Islam and Islamic thought is where we meet the necessity for production of new knowledge. We need to generate an understanding of the same ethical trajectory, but in a way that does not support and sustain the hegemonic context in which it was originally articulated and in which it was a little bit stuck. So that's just one of the ways, and you see it has multiple facets and also multiple implications, because in the context of Muslim personal status law, it is fundamentally understood on the basis of this hegemony, and it comes up against the state, which simultaneously tries to articulate a constitutional right of equality between citizens, but they can't give it to people who are practicing Muslim personal status law or Muslim family law, because that law is fundamentally based on hegemony. So the state then becomes a supporter of a double standard, which is not tenable. So I love the ways in which just thinking about the positionality that created an understanding of justice which was unequal, and the positionality of the challenge to that location, working on the basis of equality and reciprocity.
Yeah, it's fascinating, a lot to look forward to. But continuing with this and your being in Indonesia and the peasant trans and, similar institutions are coming up in South Asia too, with the madrasas etc. There is a critique, at least in South Asia, of the madrasas because they do not take a critical approach towards gender. Are you finding that happening in the peasantrans in Indonesia, or is the curriculum a little more challenging? Is it questioning? Is it asking, the right questions when it comes to gender? Because the peasantrans are gendered, and I understand that in the all-girls boarding school or the all-boys boarding school. But is there a body that is overseeing the structure of the curriculum to make it?
First, I want to say that while there are all boys boarding schools or pesantren, and there are all girls boarding schools and pesantren, there are many that have both. They do maintain certain separations because obviously this is a boarding school, so they're in dormitories and the like. But Indonesia is an agrarian society, as India is as well. And for that reason, they've been dependent on the earth. And from the earth, actually, you learn a little bit more about the necessity of the masculine and feminine working together in order to be productive. And I think that has not allowed them to keep rigid gender separation in the way I've observed it, and you had to participate in it in many other countries, particularly in this area of knowledge receipt, knowledge production. It has a very strong affirmation of female learners. It's one of the countries in the world that's had a female president, and we still haven't had that, in the United States, even though we're close now with the Vice President Kamala Harris. So that I just want to, I just want to address that before I talk about a few more, I think, important details. Also, Indonesia is the first place that I was able to identify as feminist. When I lived here 12 years ago, I realized that, I was dependent upon identities of feminism that had been counterproductive to what I would consider to be my spiritual, intellectual, and ethical integration, and that there are other articulations of feminism, and that it's time for me to participate in those others and to help construct, even more of them. And that is simply because, as I said, the balance between my intellectual, spiritual, and activist personality is greatest for me here in Indonesia because it's the backdrop. So the way that the pesantren has operated and the affirmation of women, not only as knowers, but as teachers and as leaders within these systems, is interesting to observe. I also know that a project, and this project is maybe 2 decades old, when you have reading materials produced for students, especially in the large numbers that exist in these systems, and there's a gender bias, they actually created companion text to allow for a challenge to the hegemonic gender positions that were being articulated in those texts. So the whole rereading of the sacred traditions and the affirmation of gender equality is very strong here. Obviously, the culture is still patriarchal because most cultures still are, whether religious or not religious. But I think that the movement to eradicate that here exists, interestingly enough, as much among men as among women. And that the projection of the necessity of integrating knowledge, activism, and spirit is equally shared between women and men. And that allows for the capacity to make integrated changes that simply maintain and sustain the harmony and the beauty. So it's not quite the same as the system, I think, in South Asia, I mean, it's my chosen country because it really is my favorite country in the world. And I don't do it in a, I mean, it doesn't mean that I don't have frustrations about certain little aspects of daily living, but I don't do it in a way that's careless, but rather because actually my whole being feels like the potential for me to reach the best of my whole being rests not only in being in a particular place on the planet, but also being within communities of people that understand that we must continue to challenge ourselves, to produce new knowledge, to integrate our knowledge with the challenges of the world. I mean, we don't have a formula that will tell us what is, this COVID pandemic and what are the cultural, spiritual, and economic responses to this pandemic. And we have to do this. And we also have to reflect on it from our own localities, as Muslims. I'm really hopeful that these kinds of things will come out of a place like this that will help us to go forward. I also think that it is regrettable that while Muslims in Indonesia will translate from Arabic, from European languages, from English into Bahasa, they don't translate as much from their own Bahasa to these other languages, because actually they've been in the forefront of thought for a very long time. But they have 228 million people. They have a lot of people that they can service. So I think sometimes they simply are engaged in really deep reflection and conversations with themselves, and they need to also provide opportunities for people globally to really see the kind of work that they're doing. My colleague and friend who used to be a student of mine has done an amazing project with regard to hadith and gender reading called Mubadala. And the other day somebody said to me, well, we don't have an amina wadud of hadith. And I said, yes, we do. And his name is Faqihullah. So we do have new work that's being produced here. And even though Faqih will give, forums in English, he writes for his own audience. So he writes in Bahasa. So, I think it needs to be examined globally in terms of Muslim intellectual thought. And the challenge, of course, rests not only with Indonesians, but also with the ways in which other people can have an opportunity to receive the work, should there be more translations made available. I myself am trying to study Bahasa. I mean, I can buy, rice and fish at the market, but I need to pick it up to the level where I can have more intellectual engagement. And therefore, I would have the opportunity to hear more of the work that's being generated in, the local language. It's just amazing, really.
This is fascinating, and everything is in the right direction. But I do want to speak a little bit on with Indonesia and Malaysia and many other Islamic countries is while these shifts are being made in knowledge production and in the new epistemologies that we're seeing through scholars and academic and educational programs, we are also seeing, I want to say, the power, or at least the importance of Sharia law in many of these countries which claim to be secular. There seems to be like a parallel system going on, and from a feminist perspective, especially when it comes to family laws, which impact women much more than men. So while you are in Indonesia, how do you see the reconciliation of the push and practice of Sharia laws and the secular laws?
Well, Indonesia is literally a secular democracy. It is founded on the basis of Pancasila, which is religious diversity. However, there's always the strength of the Islamist or political Islamic popularity to show up your Islamness relative to the principles and projects that are being promoted within the political Islamic agenda. So we have that here, as well. So for example, Panchasila recognizes 5 traditions, and they recently had some discourse about indigenous religious traditions, but they don't have a space for somebody who has no religious tradition, like it's not encoded, in the Constitution. So there are some challenges. And there are instances of persecution for people, for example, for being located within the Ahmadiyya manifestation of Islam. So you do have that. And also Indonesia has a very high level of people who go off to join these extremist groups and participate in, acts of destruction for others. So those problems do exist here. So it is, as you say, it's a parallel system. But the interesting thing, if you take the general population and you take the educated population, in those 2 categories, you will see that the thrust is more towards an inclusive Islam and inclusive of religious diversity and even diversity of practice and understanding of Islam from within. But the other sector exists, not just here, but elsewhere. But I keep telling people we give so much attention to the minority manifestation of extreme Islam when we need to give more attention to the majority manifestation of a much more inclusive and egalitarian and peace-oriented kind of Islam. When we add that to the conversations about Islamic law, I also am indebted to conversations from my associations with Musawa to understand a distinction between Sharia as a divine trajectory, which can never be manifest, because what is put in manifestation is always the human understanding or fiqh understanding of what is divine. As soon as you confirm and understand the human element, it means that you become a part of that human element in order to challenge inequalities and injustice that are trying to be promoted in the name of Islam and then trying to call it divine. And this is not just a problem in Southeast Asia. This is a problem all over, where somehow they call it Sharia law. They call it that in the United States. Popular Islamophobes will call it. They call it Sharia law, and there is no such thing as Sharia law, really. Sharia is like the Tao or the way. It is the affirmation of the trajectory of human well-being as a creation of Allah, the Creator. And we are in a process of that affirmation. We are on the way, but we are never finished. Instead, what we do is we take steps, and those steps are always fiqh. And fiqh is rich, it's complex, it's diverse. It used to be dynamic. One of the problems is that it has lost its dynamism in certain places. And nevertheless, because of challenge, if nothing else, there's COVID, because of challenges to existing paradigms of articulation, then even the fiqh needs to accept the necessity for rethinking the ways in which some of its fundamental understandings are put into practice. And that, of course, is what Islamic reform is all about. And for me, Islamic feminism is one of the strongest expressions of Islamic reform. First of all, because more risk was taken in order to make those articulations. But secondly, because it really created this dynamic exchange between past traditions and current realities. Third, because the reform is not possible if gender is not included. So, if you want to really learn the best way to move forward in terms of the reform in Islamic law, I really think you should look at the corpus of material created by Islamic feminists and incorporated into activist campaigns at the level of policy and practice.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And we're getting some questions. But before I get started with the questions, I just wanted to speak a little more about your project on the queer Islamic studies and theology. If you could just, enlighten us on that, and then we'll go into the question answers. Yeah.
Yes, so first it started with my, intimate relationship with queer Muslim communities and the burgeoning activity for their own well-being, their safety, their spirituality. There's so many movements, so many places in the world where, Muslims have taken agency with regard to understanding their own sexuality and their own Islam. And I've been, just really good friends with people, for about 20 years now. And yet I felt like I wasn't making any contribution myself. I was just there, a supporter or whatever. And I got an opportunity to make a research proposal, which was accepted by the Arcus Foundation. And for 3 years, I went back and looked first at the Qur'an, the tafsir, the commentary literature, and the epistemology. Then I looked at the hadith and the seerah, the stories of the Prophet and his statements. And the last year I looked at fiqh. I did a survey of fiqh, unfortunately only in the Sunni tradition. I didn't get to any Shia articulations. And when I came out of that, I had a friend and colleague who had passed away during those 3 years, who was the provost at the Starr King School for the Ministry, Ibrahim Farajaje. And he had created the Islamic Studies portion of the Starr King School for the Ministry and had been interested to integrate queer Islamic studies within their program for social change. And so because my grant was housed at the Starr King School for the last 2 years, I began speaking with them about creating what I would call the sort of Ibrahim Farajaje Center for Inclusive Islamic Studies of Sexuality, or IFSIS. And I was only at the proposal stage when I, left the country. And as part of the discourse about, coming here, I brought this conversation up again. The nuts and bolts of how to do this have not yet come together. But I am also in conversation with other friends and colleagues who are integrating gender and sexuality, in their own programs. So I see it as something that really can manifest in the next few years, where we re-examine not only some of the amazing details of classical Islamic discourse about sexuality, but also we interrogate them for their affirmation of the notion of human dignity. So I called my research Sexual Diversity and Human Dignity because the fundamental understanding of karama, laqad karamna bani Adam, the fundamental understanding of dignity for human beings is countered by anything homophobic or transphobic or biphobic. And so where does that come from? It's funny because everybody is an expert on the Quran when we start talking about homosexuality. There's no homosexuality in the Quran. Well, actually, there's no homosexuality in the Quran at all. There is a discussion about, sexual abuse, but I don't understand how that is reduced to, the full spectrum of gender non-binary expressions and intimacies, except that the lack of fully thinking is allowed to counter the unconditional affirmation of human dignity. So I would like to be a part of creating not only curriculum, but a consortium of scholars and activists who have been participating in this. And once again, queer Muslims are not waiting for the academics. I mean, I've participated in a couple of forums during the lockdown formulated by queer Muslims that were workshops and knowledge, producing forum done virtually. So they're not waiting. And yet the academy, when I left US academia, there was no such thing as Muslim women's studies. That has come, since I left, and it's still very minor. So that because there's no such thing as queer Islamic studies, only to me says eventually we will get to the place where we integrate the study of sexuality in our understandings of Islam. And for as much as I can, I want to be a part of the creation of such programs. But as I said, there's a lot of steps, and I've only made a half step forward with it so far.
Well, it's the direction that matters, I suppose. Yeah.
Inshallah.
So I will firstly want to thank you for a brilliant exposition. I mean, we can go on and on through the night. That is in California night, your day. But I think we're getting some questions. So Dr. Wadud, I'll start with some of those.
Okay.
And some of them are really general and some of them are a little more specific. But through my messages too and through a question, there is much appreciation for this opportunity that you gave us to hear you and listen to you. One of the questions is, just curious, how do you experience the spread of Wahhabism in Indonesia?
It's interesting because the phrase Wahhabism is not popular here. Salafism is, and also because organized Islamic groups that are very conservative, patriarchal, hegemonic, exclusive and the like do exist here. So they sort of have their own discourse around it, which doesn't use the phrase Wahhabism. I mean, I agree with Professor Khalid Abu Fadl about the parallelism between the use of the term Wahhabism and Salafism and, the historical origins of it. But it's just like the Deobandis in India. They have their own articulation of their own conservative, patriarchal, hegemonic, expression. And they do exist here. And as I said, there is a considerable concern about young people going to join, the extreme groups, feeling the necessity for engaging in military struggles and, leading also to destruction of things. So that exists here, but it is not the most popular sentiment. And it is not the leading sentiment. So there is enough internal challenge in order to constantly and be vigilant in creating limitations on not only how people are drawn into them, but also how to move people forward, beyond them. I am not working, I try to tell people this, I don't work on extremism. I don't work as a negation of something. I try to work only as an affirmation of something. So this is not an area where I have a lot of strength, but I do observe in society, and I do know in terms of, some conversation, but unfortunately I couldn't give you numbers. I couldn't give you, the aspects of the sort of Wahhabi Salafi expression here. It's just something I know exists, but I don't know enough of the hard details to provide a better answer. Sorry about that.
Well, I think you answered the question pretty well. We have a question. About the Zoom seminar. Somebody is joining us from Japan. And the question is, calling for justice is important. And I totally agree with what Dr. Wadud had said so far. Only I wonder, how does Dr. Wadud define the term justice? To me, the meanings of the term depend on the notions of people in a certain moment. It changes upon circumstances and may have such diversity, thus difficult to share one meaning.
Okay, so since there was as much answer in that question, I can only add to it to say that I see justice as always situational and located. And in order to read justice, then the one who experiences it must have as much say over its definition as the one who is trying to control it or make rules, laws, and policies about it in the context of the state.
Hmm.
That is why I said that in the classical period, the understanding of justice included hegemony, and that today we have an understanding of justice that must include equality and reciprocity.
Hmm.
But I don't have a more closed or fixed notion of justice. I'm only part of the expression that requires that the recipient also have a part in the articulation of it. So if the state says that these laws are just, but the result of those laws, for example, with the Black Lives Matter movement, is a disproportionate number of fatalities on Black bodies, then clearly it is Black bodies that get to say what is justice. Working on gender globally, I always ask, can there be justice if Muslim women do not experience justice? And I also know that there are not just one or two or three aspects in determining justice, but there are multiplicity, and that they may not be the same in one locality or another because of the realities of those situations. So justice is always situated, and justice is always relative to the ones who are supposed to be recipients of it. It's not a definition, it's just an explanation.
There is a question which says, what is the Islamic view of other religions? I hear from most Muslims that Islam is the only right religion and people from other religions are basically doomed. What is your comment about that?
Wow, I haven't had a question like that in a million years. So interesting. First of all, I don't believe there's any one true religion. I believe one can only truly practice, believe, and participate in the religion that they identify with. And so truth is always going to be about positionality and participation. Um, as far as the diversity of religions in the world, I myself have had a beautiful experience in the practice of three religions. From all three of them, I have gained a better understanding of religiosity and of my own identity. For example, I still practice meditation, which I first learned when I was a Buddhist while in university. I still believe in a loving God. My last name, Wadud, was taken from that experience as introduced to me by my father, who was a Christian. I never had a negative experience in the religions before I chose Islam as the path that would lead me most coherently towards the completion of my best self. And so I don't believe in one true religion, and I don't believe, furthermore, that there is one true Islam. I believe Islams have always existed and that they continue to exist today. And sometimes some people's Islam is not something I can participate in at all, and I don't want to. I think that religious diversity is a fact. It is not something you have to advocate for because it is a fact. I do very little engaged interreligious work. And that is simply because I have found the discourses have become dominated by a liberal trajectory, which does not allow for as much of the integrity that goes along with the particular participants, and that it's mostly discourse and not enough action. So I love programs like Habitat for Humanity, because if you use your religion to create alternatives for the well-being of others and the planet, I'm very happy because your religion expresses itself. If you use your religion just to have a conversation about, what are your differences and similarity with another religion, I've done that for years and years and years, and I simply found that it was redundant. There was no positive productivity from it except for discourse. So I'm very critical of most of the quote unquote interreligious dialogues that go on. And I'm more interested in the diversity of religion in participation in well-being or wellness.
There is an interesting question here. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
It's what are your thoughts on religious state ties or theocratic rule? Would a more inclusive approach separate religion and state while still allowing for religious freedom? I don't see religion as opposed to feminism, but patriarchal institutions oppose women's rights, and states tend to be patriarchal as well as mainstream religious institutions. I would like to know your thoughts on religion and state ties or religious government ties. Thank you.
Okay, so all states are made by humans, and they are structured according to human understandings of what is necessary or good. So basically, to me, all states are secular. The unfortunate reality, however, is that some states pretend that they are expressing the religious mandate, and the only religious mandate is the one that they express. I'm categorically opposed to that. However, people's religion is always integrated into how they express laws, policies, state, government, and the like. And so I am not for the notion of secularism that says you have to remove religion. Rather, I am for accepting that religion is a part of the human expression, and that humans who feel aligned with their religious identity will always be operating out of what they understand to be their religion, but that their understanding is given one vote as one citizen and not more. So I am for a radical reinterrogation of the misuse of the term secular to mean anti-religion. And I am equally against the idea that there's ever such a thing as a religious state. I think the Vatican is a state, and maybe it's religious. I don't really understand that one because it's a weird thing. But I think every place else, actually people are projecting a false notion that it's a religious state. It's a human-made state, mostly man-made and patriarchal, as you say. It's a human-made state that's abusing religion in order to allow for more authority. I have written on what I call the democratization of authority in Islam because we have a problem with this. We have a problem with understanding that the state functions for all citizens and should do so equally, no matter what their ranking in the government, and that therefore that every citizen has equal opportunity and equal right to express their opposition to any imposition from the state, and that the state's abuse of the term religion to give them double doses of authority is categorically wrong.
Thank you. I'm going to just, this is sort of the last set of questions. I'll ask it in one question. There is a question about your thoughts on inheritance. Inheritance by women, by daughters, which is half of the son. So there's a question about inheritance. And as is always the case, whenever there is a discussion on gender in Islam, you can guess it. There is a question about clarity on wife beating. And then a little separate from that is what is the legitimacy of the story of Lot or Lut in Islam?
And I'm supposed to answer these three huge questions in what? How many minutes do we have left? Okay, let me give it a try.
Just a little bit on inheritance, and I would avoid wife beating because I think that'll take up a lot of time, and there's so much.
No, I'm going to start with the wife beating, and I'm only going to refer to the research that I have done and I've written about in my first and second book. The sixth chapter of the second book inside the GenderJihad really gives a comprehensive understanding not only of the ethics, theology, spirituality, and then the necessity to challenge an understanding that you could ever beat a woman. You need to see the full breadth of the argument because we are in relationship to a particular text in the Qur'an, and the reading of that text, to which I have actually devoted a great deal of time in my life, is reductionist, and how to be able to remove that reductionism, return to the complexity, and from that complexity, construct policies that affirm, the full human dignity of all persons. So that's the, the short answer to that. Similarly, with regard to the story of Lut or Lot, the story of Lut teaches us that not everything that we want to understand is available to us in the Quran. It is a story riddled with ambiguity, and yet there is a beauty in ambiguity if we understand it as an exegetical tool. So the work that I've been doing with regard to that, I have not written on this. I've only done, sort of live expressions of it. The work that I have done on it in terms of the research on sexual diversity and human dignity is to understand the Quran as a medium of guidance, only if we can return it to sort of like the way that a good cook uses a cookbook. A good cook uses the fundamentals from the cookbook and at the same time adds a little bit more pepper because her family has a spicy palate, or less salt because, she or he is troubled by, too much sodium in there, whatever. So if we understand the Quran as a dynamic text with which we interact in our lives, we will be less prone to thinking that there are hard and fast answers always in the Quran and that we must always do it exactly the same way. So in both of those matters, it is a question of returning the text to itself in its breadth and by an affirmation of its principles, but that the manifestation of those principles can always and only be locally. And again, since we are the people of the state, we control the state, and we need to challenge any state policies that pretend that it's making a religious affirmation that then destroys the dignity and equality of other people. And as such, I forgot the first part of the three-part question. What was the first part?
The first part
The
was
second.
inheritance.
Inheritance. There's some amazing scholarship done on women's inheritance. First of all, the conclusion that a female only gets half is just categorically incorrect. There's a diversity of distributions even mentioned in the Quran. However, it does need to be interrogated by the kind of scholarship that's done by my colleague and friend, Dr. Zahia Jouerou, who's from Tunis, and also my friend and colleague, Dr. Asma Lamrabit from Morocco. These are both places that have some aspect of Islamic law in practice, but these are also scholars who read from an Islamic feminist ethical perspective. And the details are, first of all, quite beautiful, but they're really elaborate. And I'm a novice with regard to it. But not only are there more than just the 1-2 formula, there are also terms and conditions with regard to the application of any of the formulas. And I hope that we will have more opportunities to be able to see how this dynamic interaction with the text and with policy can lead us to an affirmation of the text with regard to textual principles. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we've kept you for a very long time. And, it's morning for you, isn't it?
Yes, it's somewhere in here. I have the time, but I don't know where it is.
So
9:40.
we have gone over with our time, and we have many more questions. So I'm really, really sorry to some of you whose questions we could not address. Maybe you can send them to me or to the center, and we can try and have Dr. Wadud answer them, though most of the questions that were submitted have been answered. So I really want to take this opportunity to thank you very, very much. It has been not just a great pleasure and honor, but I never thought that I would be so privileged to be in your company after reading your books and teaching your books and being in awe of you. So I am Really, really grateful that you accepted the center's invitation and was able to give such a, answer the question so brilliantly and, have this great conversation. So thank you very, very much, Dr. Wadud, for this.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed the ways that we sometimes think outside of the box of the questions that were sent to me. So especially for you, Professor, I really enjoyed the exchange. Apologies for anyone in the chat or question and answer that we didn't get to those, but inshallah, there will be other opportunities. I look forward to you all. Thanks everybody from SDSS for inviting me.
And I just want to mention before leaving that you have received an email just now with another Zoom link if you have time for you and I to have a brief conversation.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the audience and for hanging in and being such an integral part of the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Salam.